Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of the Gerhard Center Plus 100 webinar series. Today, we're very honored to have with us Andrew Kassoy, the co-founder of the B Lab, to speak with us about business as a force for good, how the B Corp movement is setting the example for transforming our economic system. Andrew is a co-founder of the B Lab. It's a nonprofit organization behind the B Corp movement. He recently stepped out of his CEO role to become executive vice chair and focus on strategy and long-term growth. Okay, I'll start again. Excuse me about this. Welcome to the webinar of the Gerhard Center Plus 100 webinar series. Today, we are honored to have with us Andrew Kassoy, the co-founder of B Lab, to speak with us about business as a force for good, how the B Corp movement is setting the example for transforming our economic system. Andrew is a co-founder of the B Lab, the nonprofit organization behind the B Corp movement. He recently stepped out of his CEO role to become executive vice chair and focus on strategy and long-term growth. B Lab's vision is stakeholders capitalism, in which business plays a transformative role in creating an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system for all. B Lab drives systemic change by changing the culture, behavior, and structure of business and the capital markets. The movement is led by example of all over 6,500 certified B Corps in 80 countries who meet high standards of social and environmental performance, legal accountability, and public transparency. Before leaving the private sector to form B Lab and with two college mates, Bart Houlihan and Jay Cohen Gilbert, Andrew spent 16 years as a partner in private equity funds at DLG, Credit Suisse, and MSD Capital. Andrew was raised in Boulder, Colorado, and graduated from Stanford University, where he was a Truman Scholar. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife, Margot Brandenburg, and 4 children, May, Jed, Ita, and Xavier. Without much ado, I just want to thank Andrew for joining us. And the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much for having me. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second to do that. Let's see. Hopefully that's showing up okay. Well, I'm honored to be here. I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking, using this presentation to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing at B Lab over the last 15 or so years, and then looking forward to some questions and a conversation with all of you as a group. And I always really value, as those questions come up, I value hard questions and also a real conversation, particularly about how the work that we're doing is relevant in your region, in Egypt specifically, but and how it could become more so over time. So looking forward to that being a two-way conversation, not just me talking at you like I'm going to do at the beginning of this presentation. So I always like to start a little bit with the headline, or thinking about what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and that headline for us, even 15 years ago, but when we were beginning our work, but even more so today, is that the economic system that we exist in, not just the one in my country, in the US, or just in Europe, or just in one place or another, but we think of it as sort of like the global economic system, which is dominated in many ways by business as one of its key actors, is failing to meet its promise, the promise that that business, or some people would describe as capitalism, has to create a shared and durable prosperity for all of us. And that's really like a systemic failure. You don't have to look too far to see whether it's extraordinary levels of inequality, or problems as a result of climate change, or labor conditions in many countries, or deforestation and a loss of biodiversity, or food insecurity, all the different ways. And we could obviously put up many more statistics instead of this, that show that the economic system isn't creating the value that it could create for billions of people, and for the planet that they all inhabit, that we all inhabit. In many ways, the last 3 or 4 years, whether it's a global pandemic or a number of major movements around the world for justice of different kinds, environmental justice, racial justice, different kinds of ethnic justice, I think have helped to accentuate this kind of system failure that we have. And we've seen in many places people rising up to demand change. And obviously, each in their own context of their own country or their own region, these uprisings are different in different places, and they are calling for different solutions to the problem. But the common thread to me is a set of structural problems that leave large percentages of the population of the planet feeling left out and not included or exploited. And that says that there's an opportunity to try to create change. The way we would describe that is like historic momentum for economic systems change, on top of lots of other things, movements for democracy and transparency and many other things, that there's really an historic momentum for economic systems change. The thing is that systems change is not like solving a specific problem, right? It's got to, you need to, like, by definition, work on trying to change a whole system. And that's very complex. The way we think about that is, if you want to change an economic system, you really need two things. First, you need evidence of systems failure, like that the existing system isn't working. And each of those slides that we just talked through are meant to try to give you a sense of different ways in which people are coming increasingly to see that the system doesn't work. And then you need some kind of viable alternative. You can't just call for systems change if you don't have some kind of alternative system in mind. And so when we started our organization, which is called B-Lab, about 16 years ago, our idea was admittedly audacious, which was that we ought to be building an economic system that's inclusive and equitable and regenerative, that works for all people and for the planet. And so we, three of us who had been good friends for a long time, ever since university, but each gone off and done different things in the private sector. So we were all more experienced in business and as investors in the capital markets than we were in issues of social justice. We came to our work with that lens to our work, and the idea was to try to drive some kind of a change in the economic system. Certainly not by ourselves, recognizing that many other people were working on these issues, but trying to bring a unique perspective to that because of our private sector experience. We started, because we were three Americans, we started in the United States by building a US nonprofit organization, or an NGO. And then starting to try to build a global network of partners, which today spans most continents, with independent but partnered organizations that are working on building a movement for economic systems change in their part of the world. And as you'll see, in Africa, we have an office or a team based in Kenya that's mostly focused on East and South Africa. And so one of the things I'd love to talk about is what might make this work relevant in North Africa. I think it's important, before I sort of talk about B Corps themselves, to just talk about, like, what do we think we're really trying to do? Like, what does it mean when people talk about systems change? So in our case, when we think about what we're trying to achieve, it's changing the economic system by doing three things. First, and ultimately, what we want is business and investors, like the big actors in the private sector, to change their behavior. Like, we want them to have a different kind of impact on each of their stakeholders, their workers, the communities in which they do business, the environment that we all depend on. We want businesses and investors to be considering those things and improving them when they do business. But that doesn't just happen on its own. And so there are two other things that we really think about a lot in terms of trying to change the system. The first one is cultural expectations. Like, how do we all think about the purpose of business? What is the narrative about the purpose of business? For a long time, that narrative in many places has been about maximizing value for shareholders. And so one thing that we think is critical if we want to change that system is that we actually change people's view. And that requires a lot of work on changing the narrative or our cultural expectations about the purpose of business in society. And the last one is, even if you change people's expectations, if the law, if the structure of business determines that business be done strictly for the benefit of shareholders, for maximizing wealth for shareholders, then not much can really change. And so we also think it's critical that we change the structure of business, the actual legal frameworks and the way public policy works in order to change the accountability of business so that businesses are accountable to create value for society, not just for a few shareholders. So the organization that I work for, B Lab, has really come up with a set of strategies that are really focused on these three ideas of systems change. And we have kind of 5 strategies, and I'll quickly run through them. The thing that we're most known for, because this is what we started with, was really building a community of leaders. We felt that everything else that we were going to do in order to think about systems change, which can be very abstract as an idea, we felt like it would all be built on something very easy to understand, which was defining what is a good business and then building a community of those businesses that would be highly visible. And so we created, when we started, a certification called a B Corp. The B stands for the benefit that's created for society by these businesses. And over time, we've built a community of these businesses called Certified B Corporations. When we started, there were just a little over 20 Certified B Corporations that stood up and said, we're in without really knowing what they were in for. That was in 2007. They were all 20-something of those businesses were in the United States, and most of them were small, privately held businesses. Today, there are about 6,800 Certified B Corporations. They represent every single industry you could imagine. They are in 90 different countries around the world. And so it's really spread as beyond just a certification, really kind of like a movement of companies. And I think what's really important is they all have this one unifying goal, that by meeting high standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency, that they can speak with a common identity about their values and about the need to change our economic system to work for all people on the planet. So how does a company get certified as a B Corporation? Well, it's got to do 3 things. The first is it's got to meet a set of social and environmental performance standards. And so we had to build, when we began, an impact rating system, what we call the B Impact Assessment, that would measure the impact of a business on all of its stakeholders, its workers, its community, the environment, its supply chain, its consumers, and get a minimum score on that impact assessment so that all companies that get certified have met a minimum bar for performance. The second thing is we really wanted to change the underlying legal accountability of a business. And so we created this idea of a benefit corporation, of a company that actually has a different set of fiduciary duties so that it's legally accountable for its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. And I'll talk some more in a minute about what that has meant in terms of public policy, because we've actually had to change laws in many states in the US and many countries around the world in order to make that work. And then the third thing is all of those companies sign a document called the Declaration of Interdependence, which I'll talk about more in a moment, that is really like a statement of shared purpose, of commonality between all these businesses, no matter what they do and what they really care about. Many of you will recognize some of the brand names that have become certified B Corp, some of those nearly 7,000 companies. In many countries around the world. Lots of them are recognized because they are consumer product companies, But there are many companies that you might never have heard of that do really important B2B work or financial services. So there are banks and private equity and venture capital firms. There are services businesses like architectural firms or things like that. There are manufacturers. So there are businesses in many different industries, but they all have this common idea of using business as a force for good. And this is the statement that every one of those businesses sign onto when they become certified B Corps. It matters a lot to have a statement of common purpose because we're building a community and we want these people, these businesses to see themselves as interdependent, as part of one economy that we are trying to shift, and willing to take action as a community, not just as individual businesses sort of inside their four walls. So the second strategy of the B Corp movement then is to really take those standards that B Corps use and drive them to a broader range of businesses. We're not just trying to change the behavior of 7,000 certified B Corps. What we want is to have those companies inspire all other companies to measure and manage and improve their impact. And so we provide the same tools that B Corps use for free to any company. Using that B impact assessment that I talked about a few minutes ago. Today, there are over 250,000 businesses. So remember, almost 7,000 certified B corporations, but a huge multiple of that, 250,000 companies that use that B impact assessment to measure and manage their impact. And we think that's really important because it means that hundreds of thousands of businesses and hopefully soon millions of businesses will all be using a common tool and will be thinking in a similar way about ways that they can improve their impact. Lots of other users then use that data or engage with companies around it, like private equity firms that ask companies in their portfolio to go through that impact assessment, or large multinationals that ask companies in their supply chain to use it. And through that, we have much more leverage to get larger, to get more impact. The next big thing for us is about narrative shift. Like, how do we broadcast this message of stakeholder capitalism, or as using business as a force for good? And there are many ways that we do it, but you will increasingly see, as the community of B Corps grow, that B Corp brand seen in more and more places on companies' packaging, or on their websites, or on the door of a actual store. We'll see it as more and more of these companies, when they're doing their own social media, talk about being a certified B corporation, and that gives us an opportunity to bring a message to the world about the importance of stakeholder capitalism, about using business as a force for good, and start to change the narrative about the purpose of business. One thing I mentioned a few minutes ago was the importance of public policy. When we started, most corporate law in the US and in many other countries around the world was quite explicit in saying that the duties of the directors of a corporation are to maximize value for their shareholders, and that consideration of other things like the quality of jobs that they're creating, or their environmental outputs, like how much impact they're having on the climate, that those kinds of things actually couldn't be a consideration if they weren't explicitly adding financial value for the company. And so that has led us to become much more engaged in public policy and actually trying to change underlying corporate laws. We started that here in the US by getting one state, the state of Maryland, to write a new corporate statute called a benefit corporation statute that would explicitly make a company that used it accountable to its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. Over the years, we've gotten 42 US states, most importantly, Delaware, which is where most large US corporations are incorporated, to change their laws. And so today, but in addition to that, there are about 10 countries around the world that have started to pass these benefit corporation statutes that allow companies to opt into a set of fiduciary duties that are more expansive, that really include considering their stakeholders. And now we have large coalitions of businesses in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in Brazil, and several other places that are talking to governments about how to change their corporate laws for everybody, so that we raise the baseline expectation of business to be accountable for stakeholders. finally, one of the things we've come to realize, I think that we didn't even understand when we started, was that by building a large community of businesses, we have the ability to have those businesses working together to take collective action, to build communities, not just of certified B corporations, but to provide the leadership that then lead other businesses to join in campaigns to change the way business behaves. And so whether that's now nearly 2,000 companies signing, joining our Let's Get to Zero efforts to become, to get to zero carbon by 2030, well ahead of the Paris Accords, or whether it's large numbers of companies making significant commitments to decrease inequality even within their own companies, or make big commitments to racial or climate justice. Each of these things is about having a community of companies that can speak loudly, collectively, and take action. And I think we're just starting to see the power of that, particularly as we engage with government, because as you all know, businesses, when they speak to government, have a lot of power. The question is whether we can get businesses to speak to government about things that are good for society and not just good for themselves. And that's where I think we have a lot of potential impact in the years to come. And so I'm really excited about that work going forward. So in conclusion, I would just say that we think about now as like a critical moment of transformation where this relatively small community of global companies is starting to have the kind of impact that can really change economic systems, not just in their own countries, but globally. And that will require much more than just B Corps to become strong advocates, but the B Corps can act as a powerful agent, and all of you can play a really important role, I think, in supporting that by being by pushing other companies to join this movement, by the choices that you make about where you work or who you buy products from, or what kinds of companies you invest in. Every one of us has the ability to have an impact on that system. So I'll stop sharing my screen there and look forward to now to a conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Andrew, this is very interesting, very mind opener. Let me ask you a few things initially, but I'm gonna go out of the plan I had before. I couldn't help compare what you're doing to a current wave of ESG, and it's more of reporting. And I could see that ESG eventually is going to have standards. I mean, you cannot just have people sort of reporting it whichever way they want. So eventually you'll have rigid standards. The main difference that I see, which is very much, I think it's a leap of faith, that you get into, it's not just an issue of reporting. You get into the charter of the company, and they'll have to put a phrase that makes it clear that they are more into stakeholders than shareholders' value. This is one. Then the declaration of interdependence. What you're trying really to form is try to form a community of change agents, which is way harder than, and I think it's more impactful, and I think it will cause systemic change. So I just wanted to hear your reflections on this.
Yeah, those are great questions. We could spend an hour just talking about those couple of things. First of all, just on the ESG question that you started with, just so everybody, in case people don't know, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's really a movement that started with investors asking companies to, as they're having a lens on how to invest, that they're considering environmental, social, and governance issues in their investments. And that's then become something that companies talk about. I would say in some cases, companies talk about ESG and it's what we would call like window dressing or marketing. And one of the reasons we wanted to create our certification was so that there was a distinction between good companies and just good marketing. The second thing is that ESG is often, because it sort of came from an investor lens, ESG usually means thinking about environmental, social, or governance factors that are financially material, which is a good sort of like baseline place to start and an obvious place to start for investors. But the things that are financially material are not necessarily the things that have the most impact. And so when we thought about creating a set of standards for certification, we tried to do something that was quite different than ESG standards, which was really to think about the things that have the most impact on society and the environment and build those into our impact assessment. So we are explicitly not thinking about just the things that are financially material. We're concerned with the ways that business affects society. And that then maybe gets to your second question, which is about sort of like the power of the certification or the community. I think when we started, we knew we were building a community and that there would be really great things that would come from those businesses seeing themselves as part of something larger than their own, just their own brand, identifying with like a common or an ingredient brand. What I think we didn't realize is that there's like a social movement element to what we're building. As three people coming from the private sector, none of us were well schooled in social movements. But I think what we've come to understand over time is that a movement is like, my partner will also often say, it's like a community in motion is a movement. And so the B Corp community, when you get them like moving towards a set of common objectives, all of a sudden you have kind of movement type energy. There's a lot of inspiration from that. And there's a lot of power in that if we can figure out how to exercise it, that I think could be really positive. And that's quite different than, just to return to your initial question, that's quite different than just getting companies to measure and report on their ESG performance. And again, I think it's valuable to have all companies reporting on ESG. Most of the conversation, like with mainstream institutional investors and with government about reporting, is about ESG. And I think one of the most important things that the B Corp movement will need to do over time is to push everyone further towards actually thinking about impact and towards having a kind of governance and a sense of common destiny that's different than just are we reporting on our climate impact or on our wages.
Lovely, lovely. I loved your BeTheChange.com, the marketing. This is very much like a Gandhi style social movement.
Yeah. Well, some people would say the B in B Corporation stands for the benefit that's created for society. If you're a bit more of a follower of Gandhi, you'd say the B stands for be the change you seek in the world.
Yes, exactly. Now, I've asked you that question before, but for the benefit of the audience, I want to say it again. You started with a nice idea, 3 friends. It's still an idea. Now, to go to a point where it becomes a movement, that probably took lots of time, lots of convincing, lots of frustrations, lots of... so I just wanted to get from the beginning, how did you get it from just an idea between 3 friends to a movement?
I wish there was sort of like a magical story or a revelation or something like that. But it turns out that building anything is mostly just a lot of hard work and a lot of recovery from failure. And so when we started, it actually, the thinking for this started a few years before, and it started with each of us actually thinking about it in quite different ways. So my 2 partners had built, were entrepreneurs and operators who had built a business, a consumer products brand called And One. And they had thought a lot about this from the perspective of business operators, like, oh, how could we, after selling that company, how could we start a new business that would really incorporate in a very careful way, care for workers and the environment and the communities in which we do business. And how could we make that meaningful and lasting through the structure of the business? I, as an investor, had been thinking a lot about like the structure of the capital markets and how we might try to change the way investors behave and what they choose to invest in and how they engage with businesses. And so it was sort of like these different experiences that brought us together and start thinking about it. And it took us 2 or 3 years to go from thinking about starting a company together to thinking about starting a fund that would invest in responsible businesses, to finally realizing that the real thing that was missing was some of like the market infrastructure. You know, we have hundreds of years of building economic infrastructure for a system that has one purpose, which is to maximize value for the people investing in those businesses, and very little market infrastructure for all the people who want to start a different kind of company or invest in it or work for it or buy from it. And so we thought, oh, what's really needed is some of that market infrastructure that would allow all business to be done in a different way. But that took us a few years of thinking. So when we really started in 2007, when we had the first group of B Corps, we had been through several different models of thinking and gotten lots of feedback on all the things that were wrong with those ideas before we came out with the certification. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, yes, it just took a lot of hard work. I mean, I worked on Wall Street for a number of years, and so I have already had the experience of doing the like 80 or 100 hour a week of hard work. But this was a different level from that, especially in the early years, because both because it was personal and because it was our own idea. And so a lot felt like it was riding on succeeding, and we had a lot of rejection. Lots of companies said no, or you guys are crazy, or call me back when there's actually some success here. And I would say the biggest success factor was we were able to find the entrepreneurs or the business leaders who were already doing this with their own businesses, but could see the value in banding together, in that they could have more influence or more impact in the world if they worked together than if they did this alone, just inside of their own business. And so in most ways, the success of the movement is really founded on those first 5 or 6 years of the business leaders who chose to put that B Corp logo on things when the B Corp logo had no value. But they created that value by doing it collectively. And now that's led to, it's much easier now for a company to look at it and say, oh, this is something successful for me to associate myself with. I can grow from being a part of it. And it's going to be of value to all of my stakeholders.
Okay, I'm going to continue with the discussion, but for the audience, please, if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you raise your hands, I'll let you unmute and show yourself and ask your question. Now, to follow up on your discussion about the starting. Now, obviously, when you're starting, you said entrepreneurs, you said people who are actually doing this. So by design, those guys are not mainstream. Probably they tend to be small, medium-sized businesses were privately held. Is that a correct statement?
Certainly in the early years, that was a correct statement. Almost all the businesses in the first 5 years were less than $100 million in revenue, and usually privately held, often like family-owned businesses. As we got a little further along, maybe in years 4 and 5, we started to get companies certifying that were still private, but had outside investors. So as opposed to being like a family-owned business or having, sort of like friends and family as the investors, we started to get companies that had like mainstream venture capital firms as their investors. And as that happened, that led really to two things. One, we started to have the credibility that some larger companies started to see very cool small private companies as B Corps and say, oh, we want to be like them because those businesses are authentic and they have a real following. So for example, like a Patagonia, the clothing company, became a B Corp, and we started to see other companies look at that and say, oh, we'd like to be like them. Or they looked at companies that had venture investors and said, oh, investors actually will invest in these kinds of companies. So we'd like to be a B Corp because maybe some of the friction that we thought would be there where a company might not be able to get investors now seems to be gone. So those were very important turning points for us. The other thing sort of like that followed from that was once venture investors did it, then that meant that some of those same companies, as they continued to scale, then went to talk to larger private equity investors or to institutional investors in the public markets. And so those investors started to hear about it, and they realized if we want to invest in this company, then we have to like accept this different model for doing business. And so what that's led to, and it's taken a while, is some public market acceptance. So today, globally, about 50 companies are public companies with institutional investors, and many hundreds of them are venture or private equity backed. And so today it's become much more mainstream because investors have begun to accept it. They see that whether it's as a tool for companies to attract and retain talent, or a way for them to attract other investors who are interested in these kinds of issues, that most of the friction has gone away, and in fact it can add value. And so I think that's been a fundamental shift. And so today we have many companies that have billions of dollars of revenues, not just hundreds of millions. And as I said, even now about 50 public companies, and that number is continuing to grow quickly.
Lovely. I have two questions. I'm going to start with Sylvan, Maryland. Please unmute yourself, show yourself, and ask your questions. Sylvan?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on the move, so you won't see me.
No worries.
And right, this is fantastic. Congratulations on starting that and sticking with that. I have actually two questions. You probably realize when at some point you looked at the ecosystem that and you mentioned Patagonia and the others that were trying to also to make some sort of standards out of the same concerns. How do you converge over time with these over undertakings? That's the first question. And the second question is, in a sense, are you actually creating a movement that just moves because it gets like-minded companies and like-minded actors together, or you also see people getting further than their original performance? That is, for example, I mean, you mentioned this subset of companies that joined the Let's Get to Zero pledge. Have they actually gotten to zero? Or when they joined the benefit for society or B Lab certification, are they actually increasing their benefits over time? I mean, how does getting the certification and gotten has it gotten any increase over time?
Those are great questions. So first on the issue of convergence, I think this is very important thing that has to happen next. We've been through this period over the last 10 years or so where lots of people were building different kind of pieces of market infrastructure, and for the most part, building them separately. And so that now needs to start to change. I think that most of what's out there that's been built is these kinds of like ESG reporting standards and metrics. There's been some consolidation finally amongst some of those groups that were doing that work, which is, I think, is very important because it allows for more likelihood of sort of like some standards in the public markets for reporting and public policy. And I think now we have to figure out like how we map our impact standards to those ESG standards. For the most part, they actually map pretty well to each other. It's more that it's not like we don't ask the same questions that are coming up in ESG disclosure reporting. It's more that we think that's like a necessary baseline, but insufficient for what we ultimately need to see happen. And so we are working on partnerships, for example, with the ISSB, which is really like meant to be like a global reporting effort around ESG standards. And then now I'm going to forget exactly how you worded your second question. Do you mind asking it one more time just so I remember?
Just about seeing what
right.
legal
Impact improvement
measurement does to management.
Yeah. Yes. So one of the core principles of the B Corp community is this idea of continuous improvement. And so there are a few ways that we drive that. One is that our standards themselves get revised every 3 years. And so over time, the objective is to keep raising the bar a little bit at a time as we redo the standards every 3 years and companies come back through to recertify, because as we learn about what's important or what has most impact, we want to be constantly moving the community towards continuous improvement. So at one level, that's built into the standards and the certification through the process of creating standards. The second thing is that we really work hard to encourage companies to engage on their impact assessment and constantly work towards improvement. So some of it's built into the tech platform. There are a lot of tools for setting targets or recognizing sort of things that will be easy to change over the next 3 years and other things that you might need to set as like longer term objectives for transformation to improve your score. And we do see some improvement in companies' scores on the impact assessment over time. So that's really important. And then the last thing is these kind of like campaigns around specific issues. And on those, one of the things that we have to get better at actually is figuring out how to hold companies accountable or give them the tools to make sure that they're improving. So you asked, for example, on the net zero campaign, we're already tracking how those companies are doing. The answer is most of them, this has only been over the last year or two, most of them are far away from getting to net zero. The objective was to get them to set a timeline and a set of steps that they're going to take between now and then to get to zero by 2030 instead of by 2040 or 2050. And so we'll see over the next few years how good those companies are doing at making incremental steps. But I think very importantly, we've partnered with other organizations in order to make sure that have like expertise around specific issues like measuring carbon, like for example, the We Mean Business Coalition we've partnered with in order to make sure that the companies in the B Corp community have assistance in getting there and that we're tracking it very carefully.
Super. The next question is from Ihab Ilfuli. Please unmute yourself, and if you can also start your video if you want. Ihab, floor is yours, my dear.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Dr. Avni, and thank you for such a great session. Two important points for us in the Middle East. What can be the most critical factors to assess and how to cater for the specificity of the community? Are there any type of special factors that should be measured differently when we are measuring US companies versus Middle East-based companies, especially like places like Saudi Arabia. If we would like to measure carbon emission and so on, are those the right and most important factors, or maybe other societal factors that should be measured? Thank you.
This is a great question, and another one that we could take a very long, deep dive into. As the B Corp movement has grown globally, we've had to make some significant changes in the way we develop standards, because for the reasons that you just raised. Like, the original set of standards applied pretty well to US companies, and we had different versions of them based on the size of the company and the industry it was in. But they didn't necessarily work well in markets that were emerging markets, or certain places or other places around the world. And so we built an outside standards advisory council initially that had a lot of global representation, and that led us to develop many different versions of the standards that applied better in some emerging markets. Then we started to create regional advisory councils that helped vet the standards questions in different markets. And so while the categories of questions and the scoring mechanisms are meant to create sort of like a common way of looking at companies, the underlying questions that the companies are answering and the weighting of those questions change depending on their region, their size, and their industry. What I would say is that is like also though a work in progress, meaning no company that goes through it, no matter where they are in the world, is ever fully satisfied, because some of the questions are meant to try to create some comparability across markets. And that inevitably means somebody goes through the questions and says, oh, well, this one doesn't really apply so well in my particular country, or you're missing this specific thing that we do that has a lot of impact that you're not asking about. And so the important thing is that we're constantly, just like I said, we will expect the companies to be on a journey of continuous improvement. We have to do the same thing with the standards. And I think as we grow the number of markets, that leads to some need for revisions in the standards and revisions in the way we do scoring. And so one of the things that's happening actually right now is we're going through a evolution of the standards in order to create sort of like a next generation of performance standards. And one of the big questions is how we address not just like industrialized versus emerging markets, but different kinds of regional customs and laws. And so there's lots of work to be done there, and there are a bunch of very fair critiques, I would say, of the places where those standards might fall short. And then the last thing I would say is one of the most difficult things to do is to figure out how to address how we work, how the standards work in places where business is more entangled with government, where business is much more heavily influenced by, or even often owned by, government. And it's like that creates some other complexities that we have to figure out how to deal with.
Thank you. Next one is Amira. Amira, please unmute and show yourself, please. Amira?
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Yes.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi.
Perfect. Hi. So I think I don't have a question. It's kind of more of an intervention. So first of all, thanks, Dr. Ali, for bringing the B Corps and the B Lab discussion into the Middle East, particularly Egypt. And of course, thanks, Andrew, for being here with us. I was privileged to work with B Lab Global since 2020 on a research project with the University of Florida on the motivations and the challenges that the companies in East Africa face. So I was working also with the BLab Africa partner and also Systema Bay for my second research question on how to understand how the Systema Bay had made success with the SMEs in Latin America, and how can we leverage that into the East African context if possible. So I was working with Irving, and yes, and now I've got my training with BLab Africa also as the B leader, so that I can support businesses. Yes, and just wanted to bring in another aspect of the African companies, since I met some of them in my research and also during COP27. And so everyone said that it's kind of an educational tool for them, so that they can do benchmarking for where they want to go and what kind of achievements or social and environmental impact that they want to achieve. Maybe my question would be if you want to maybe touch upon how can also the certification benefit SMEs in emerging economies. I think that's would be great for our region. Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, if you look across the B Corp movement, as I said earlier, most of the B Corp movement is made up of SMEs. Increasingly, there are large companies and subsidiaries of large companies. So actually, probably the largest B Corp in Egypt is Danone Egypt, which is obviously a subsidiary of a large French dairy company, but with a lot of operations in Egypt. And there are many examples of that. So one thing I would say about SMEs is we're increasingly working with large companies that are really thinking a lot about their supply chains or their subsidiaries. And I think one way in many markets to work with SMEs is to make sure that they have good exposure to larger supply chains. Another, I think, opportunity is actually on the public policy front is to help try to do things that give preference to SMEs in local markets that are creating high quality jobs or other like important things to the local economy. And I think that we have seen some evidence that you can like use Corp certification or the legal structure as a way to help define what those kinds of positive impact behaviors are of businesses, and then put them into like public policy opportunities. So, and especially as we see the B Corp community growing, there are more and more of those opportunities on the supply chain side to really encourage these businesses to be working together on doing business with each other instead of doing business with other people. Oh, Dr. Ali, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Joseph, please unmute yourself and start your video.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and it's a pleasure to not only meet you, but also be inspired by the impact that you've been able to make, Mr. Kassoy. And so, how the B Corp movement could be applied to the North African market piqued my interest quite a bit. I mean, there's definitely some opportunity in holding the corporations accountable in these emerging African regions. And so with the Kenyan office already being at the forefront of that, with East and South Africa, it sort of begs the question of how it could still be applied in this region and the different landscape of which you may conduct business. With the business, especially in this region, being so entangled with, influenced, or owned by government, what actions might be needed to be taken to increase the positive actions that have to be taken by these businesses? I mean, it definitely seems that giving them the tools to make sure that they're improving is a big part of it. And accessibility is a major factor in this sort of region, right? I mean, with big incentives of time and time again of just not fixing what isn't broken per se, even if it's not the best course of action that these corporations can take. It begs the question of how much intervention is actually needed and, you know, how to go about that. And so to hear your thoughts on this would be really inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It's really thoughtful. And obviously I don't have any expertise in Egypt and Egypt's economy. And so at some level, what I really want to do is ask you that question rather than just speaking. I'll talk for just a minute about maybe some of my experiences elsewhere. One of the previous questions mentioned this organization called Sistema Bay, which is our partner in Latin America. And they're working in many different markets in Latin America, some of which you would characterize as truly like emerging economies, but others that are industrialized economies, but where the challenge is much more, there's a lot of government intervention, or there are real challenges to businesses behaving in the way that we want them to, because of the way big business is sort of like works in concert with government. And one of the lessons, I think most important lessons, is they've really thought differently than we did in the US. In Latin America, they thought a lot about how you build an ecosystem of the different actors that are really needed in order to not necessarily exercise power, but like raise these issues into the public consciousness so that more and more people are demanding that things be done differently. And so they've taken much more of an ecosystem approach that's really engaged a lot of people as citizens, as workers, as investors. Even though they might not be ready to get certified as B corporations, they're taking those principles and trying to talk about them in the narrative. In many cases, that's working with universities so that they're engaging young people, but also trying to engage like wherever there's any kind of form of independent media. And then the other thing I would say is there's a lot of thinking about like, well, what's in the interest, therefore, of if government and business are so intertwined, like what's actually in the interest of some of those leaders in government that helps them feel like they're doing things that are sort of good for them. And so there's a lot of, I would say, narrative to build about the way these companies and these standards allow for high quality jobs that are really in their interest as leaders in government, for example, or like accrue to their benefit. So obviously none of that answers for your specific situation there, and I'd love to engage in that conversation, because I think one of the most important things for us as we try to engage in different regions or different countries is making sure that we're doing it in a way that's actually helpful. And we don't have much of a presence there today, but we'd love to over time. And I think it's really a question of like what could be valuable and what's the right model in your market.
Okay, I think we're running slightly out of time. So if I can take your permission to just sort of go for another maybe 5-10 minutes. We have 3 questions. We can take first question from Mu'taz Darwish, then Abdullah Ashraf, then Ayman Shahat, and then we conclude. So I'm going to start with Mu'taz. Please unmute yourself and start your video.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Apologies
Yes.
about the move, and yeah, I hope you can hear me. And
yes, we can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Okay. So my question is more of how far can we go with influencing ESG and the likes through policies and standards versus influencing the demand side? And I have sort of some evidence from some of my research on big oil, and it's clear that they always say we are happy to go that way, conditional that the society would move with us. So there is always this conditionality of society moving so they can move. There is also obviously the energy security versus energy transition, and it's very clear recently that energy security wins. and demand wins, and countries who want energy demand wins over ESG and net zero and the likes. There is also always the threat that if you keep pushing big corporates into this sort of quote unquote corner, these business opportunities would flee into private pockets that standards cannot reach. But the impact would still stay, and it won't be favorable. But so I hope I'm clear in these thoughts and questions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I'm not sure exactly what the question is. But I think that your observations are pretty accurate. Is there a question that comes from that you want me to answer?
Mutaz?
Lost.
Maybe he has a problem with the communication. He's on the road. Okay, let's go with Abdullah Ashraf. Please unmute yourself. Ask your question, Abdullah.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you so much, Andrew, for taking the time and sharing the B Corp story. So from my understanding that the impact assessment is very sector and industry specific, and that made me just question the variability of, because now it provides a very customized notion of what impact and accountability is. I wanted to question the variability of if a company is working in the same sector, but then you have a differentiation between a developed country and a developing country. Should they be set to the same standards, even though they are different in maturity, in contribution to sustainability issues, and into their accountability as well to the sustainability agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is a balancing act. So in some ways, our standards are built sort of like almost like an old-fashioned card catalog. So there's lots of questions in there, and we can sort of like pick and choose depending on context. So many of the questions that every company gets are going to be exactly the same, because there are some core things that we think are equally important no matter where you are. There are other things that have to be a little bit more context specific, and we're sort of balancing those things in order to get to make sure that we're getting at things that really matter. So just as an example, and this isn't necessarily just about like region, it's also about industry. So if we ask the same questions of a manufacturer as we ask of a bank, then there are some really critical things we won't get to. So, for example, with the bank, if we ask the same questions as we ask the manufacturer, what we won't really get to in any at any granular level is whether the bank's lending practices are actually structured to create benefit for marginalized communities or businesses that otherwise might not be able to get credit. And so we have to have additional questions or an addendum to the main part of the standards that get at that for banks. And I could go on with lots of different industries where that's really important. And so we are balancing those things in trying to create some comparability. The important thing that comes along with that then is transparency. So when these companies go through our impact assessment, if they get certified, they also have to have their impact assessment is transparent on our website, so people can look and see, oh, this company and this company may both be certified B corporations, but this one might be performing not so well in terms of its worker practices. Like it did great on the environment and some of the community things that it does, but actually it's not paying all of its workers a living wage or some other things that really need to be uplifted.
Thank you, Abdullah. Mu'taz is back. I'm not sure if he wants. Mu'taz, do you want to ask your question? Seems we've lost him again. Okay. Boy. Okay. Do you mind if we take just one question from Joseph?
Sure, no problem. Let's do one
Okay,
more.
Joseph, please unmute and ask your question. Try to keep it brief.
Of course, though it doesn't seem like my video is starting. Thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Andrew. Personally, I definitely feel that separating the public and private sectors, but also the government owned and publicly managed businesses is going to be a big factor of whether or not this sort of movement, like the B Corp movement, succeeds in this region. And so when you ask me the question, how, I perceive that, how will you be able to penetrate this sort of market? I mean, it's definitely going to require a lot of government. We can call it an extra push, I guess you can say.
Well, one thing I think that's really been important, this is regardless of market, is that we've taken the approach of trying to build this movement by starting with the companies that are willing, that want to be a part of it. And then sort of in some ways following their lead on what they are passionate about. And so I think as we build a community of companies, you then have the ability to sort of take action or speak to government or speak truth to power in a way that you can't when it's just an individual business, and that equally you can't if it's us sort of as our organization sort of showing up in your country and saying this is how business should be done. That we know doesn't work very well. What's really powerful is when businesses are sort of deciding how they want to do that. And so I think there's the kind of the entrepreneurial approach and the practical approach actually work quite well in allowing the community to start to figure out what's actually possible in their market, and then taking action. And we are in very much of a support role. So my hope would be there that the first thing that happens is we find like-minded leaders who want to be part of this. And then that's not going to change the economic system in Egypt. What it's going to do is start to form the community that can figure out together what the best strategy is to do that in their market, because they're going to know much better than we will. And that's why we in each place we start with, how do we just create the opportunity for companies to get certified and to become a part of the community, and then to figure out what they do next.
Okay, I think we're a little bit around 10 minutes beyond time. Andrew, I really want to thank you. I mean, first for participating in our webinar series and being so generous, staying little over the time that we agreed on.
It was my pleasure to do it. It's much easier for me. It's the middle of my day. It's the end of yours. So it's been great. And as I said at the beginning, we're really interested in building relationships there and in starting to figure out how we can form a community of B Corps at some point, and really excited to have an ongoing conversation about that.
I'm sure. Just give me a few weeks or so, and I'll get back in touch with you, and we'll see what we can do.
Great.
What we can do for North Africa. Now, I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. On Wednesday, we're going to have with us Richard Engstrom. He is a founder of something called an Impact Business Modeling System, which is a Danish company. And he's going to talk about make sustainable impact measurable, operational, and profitable. And it should be interesting to continue some of the conceptual talk we've done today. And he has a system that he actually uses in the Nordic countries to measure impact. So I hope to see you on Wednesday. And again, thank you, Andrew, for being our guest. And I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.